capital campaigns, and not all of them for churches. I worked for the world's largest nonprofit consulting firm owned by Allied Irish Bank, and did fundraising for, my theology's all mixed up. I'm sorry. I grew up a Methodist minister's kid. My dad served in the Texas Conference. He died when I was 18. But he always taught me, anyway, that magnetic north is Jesus Christ, and don't worry so much about some of that other stuff. And so I kind of took some of that to Word. So 30 years ago when I first started, I raised money for the Roman Catholic Church. I worked for the Jesuits. Then I mentioned I lived in Kenya, raised money for the East African Presbyterian Church. I did strategic planning for the Church of England. And I've done campaigns for a lot of secular causes, colleges and universities, Southern Baptist, I forgot about them. So, I don't know. My wife's Presbyterian, so when she's not ushering, I'm in church with her at her church. And when she's ushering, I go to my church. So we do get to worship together. So I don't know if that's kind of mixed up, but I raise money not for budget support for GBOD, thank heavens. We're already supported and funded through the gifts, through your offering plates, through the World Service Funds. What I raise money for mission expansion, projects that wouldn't happen if it weren't for what I do. In my projects, for instance, we're raising money now for e-readers and theological libraries for seminarians in Africa who can't even have a full Bible. They never even had one book for their theological education, and so that's kind of the stuff that I do, and it's a lot of fun. I put my contact information on here in case after today you wish to talk. I'm more than happy to share with you what I know. You're gonna get a drink of water out of a fire hydrant. So we're gonna have to fly through a lot of information so that I can answer questions for you at the end. But if we don't have enough time, I'm more than happy to be a resource for you. And I can bring a lot of different perspectives, including, for instance, what it means to have to hire outside campaign counsel and how much that costs and what makes up good counsel, and any of those kind of things I'm happy to help you with. So why don't we get started? There are 3 books I'm going to show you here. And by the way, if I can get your email addresses, I'll send you this slide presentation so you don't have to write everything down. But there are 3 books I'm going to suggest to you right at the beginning. Bishop Snazy's book, primarily because of this chapter, Extravagant Generosity. It was mentioned in the talk this morning. It's really an interesting conversation, and I'm sure probably all of you have been exposed to that. The next, I love this book. It's now old, printed by the Alban Institute, More Than Money. It's 11 case studies of how different churches use stewardship to change their culture. I know that sounds maybe odd, but it was all around the idea, first off, that stewardship and fundraising are not synonymous, that giving of your treasure is just part of the stewardship conversation, and every one of these congregations had that in healthy perspective. But also how the crackle came from having aggressive mission as a congregation. So these 11 case studies are really interesting. They're not, I think there's a Methodist church in there, but different denominations. And then one of my favorite books, whether you're, if we'll talk about case statements, but case statement is your argument for support. You have to write that so that your congregation understands what it is they're being asked to give to. And this is a wonderful book to help you shape that. And it's not just case statements for capital campaigns, but also it will help you for annual giving programs or planned giving programs. And Tom Ahearn is arguably the best case statement expert in the country. So this book is worth buying. Obviously not very thick or big, but just full of wonderful information. The book I want to start with is the one, though, that I handed to each of you. If you don't have a copy, we have some here. They might look a little different. It was a different printing. If you want more copies of this, you can get them through the upper room. how many of you have seen Henri Nouwen's book? Okay. I use this all the time. Even after 32 years of being in this business, I still get scared before I ask people for money. Isn't that weird? And it's because I lose focus on what it is I'm really trying to do. And I'll show you why Henri helps me. Henri's Roman Catholic, by the way. He's dead now. He was Dutch, educator in the United States. I love this. And I'm going to give you a handout of 20 other quotes from the book, too, to help you use it as a guide. But fundraising is always a call conversion. And this is why I have to read it. Because I lose track of, gee, what if they're going to say no? What if they don't like what I have to offer? What if I embarrass them because I'm talking to them about money? And then I go to this, and no, God is bringing me, the asker, into a unique conversation with the potential donor around something God would like to see happen. And so it's a collaboration opportunity. The patriarch of the Rockefeller family, John Rockefeller, had an unusual view on asking, but I think it's right on. He saw it in asking his friends to give to projects he believed in as the same as inviting some of his business partners to invest in key stocks or business opportunities. Here was an opportunity for them to change their life, to benefit themselves, and he was inviting them to do something significant. So he saw this collaboration opportunity as being a wonderful conversation to have with friends, not something to be scared or shy of. You were inviting them to do something they could not normally be involved in. And it was going to change their life if they were involved. I think that's really healthy. Also, Henri, fundraising is, I don't know if y'all believe this. As y'all were telling me, some of you who were telling me you're lay, I'm lay, about being involved, it just struck me, a saying I heard many years ago, blessed are the fundraisers, for in heaven they shall sit at the right hand of the martyrs. So, if you're looking for a fast track to heaven, be on the stewardship committee because you've got a saved place for yourself. But it is a beautiful activity if it's approached with joy and hope, not, oh my gosh, I've got to go ask somebody for money and I just dread it like crazy. Obviously, you're not going to do very well if you're not approaching it as Henri suggests. And prayerful, from beginning to end. Fundraising is a ministry grounded in prayer and gratitude, right? So even though your ministry may have problems today, I'm the chair of Camp Sumatanga in North Alabama. And 4 years ago, we had the conference responded to a We're Dying appeal at annual conference, and they gave $622,000 to help retire debt. And then we had an anonymous donor give $722,000 that retired long-term capital debt. 4 years later, we have $600,000 debt, and I've got a meeting with that donor on Monday, the $722,000, and he's wanting to know, gosh, did I just waste my gift? And it's a very good question, but we did not do a good job of approaching the gifts we received 4 years ago with gratitude. So we're going to have to go back to solve our next problem, financial problem, where it doesn't solve the endemic issues or systemic issues that are causing the financial issues in the first place. We've got to go back to people that we didn't say thank you appropriately to in the first place and ask them to give again. What do you imagine that reception is going to be like? Makes it tough. So the starting point is prayer. When we have more time, I usually do pray from Nouwen's book, but I just wanted to point out something for you. If you go to page 56 in the green one, and I'm not exactly sure where it is in the blue one, I probably can find it real fast. It's at the very back. It's at page 34 in the blue one, 56 in the green one. They're the same. They're just printed differently. I didn't have, this is what I do when I pull out Henri's book and I need some magnetic north. I use that page where it says prayer is the radical starting point. Do y'all see that? And I just take sentences out. God, help me uncover the hidden motives and unacknowledged wounds that shapes my relationships. Help me see myself as others and as you see me. Help me as I seek your voice and allow your word to penetrate my fear and resistance. So, I don't know, I just encourage you to take this book and read it, but maybe use that page if you're looking for a daily prayer on keeping yourself focused. Oh, sorry. If we had more time, one of the exercises I would do with you is let's list the hopes we have around capital campaigns. And the reason I still throw this slide up is this is something to do with your finance committee or your administrative board or your leadership team, is let's list the hopes we have around the concept of running a capital campaign. What do we hope to achieve? But also, what is it we fear? Because it's only by making it clear what we fear that we can address those issues. So I would suggest you go through that exercise. And I think when you do address those fears face on or head on, it makes you fearless. Does that make sense? A capital campaign is different than your annual giving effort in that it usually is for pledges. People make pledges 3 to 5 years, sometimes 2 years, sometimes 6. There's no magic to this. It just depends on when you've got to have the money in to do what you're doing. But usually capital campaigns are for bricks and mortar or endowment. They're not for annual budget support. As soon as I say that, though, many capital campaigns work your annual fundraising into its appeal so that you're really making a dual ask. To the person who's given before, you say, we'd like you to consider giving X amount, which is 10% more than you gave last year, to the annual fund. And we'd like you to consider a 3-year pledge of X amount to the capital campaign. Does that make sense? You don't want them to discontinue their annual support that you have to have for your mission work, but you also want them to grow in their giving toward your capital campaign priorities. So that does make the conversation a little bit more complicated, but capital campaign obviously is above what you have to have on a yearly basis just to function. By the way, and we'll talk about it more in case statements, but do you know what the top 3 reasons you ask people to give would be? The top 3 primary motivational points or projects that they would respond to the most? Here's what I've heard it. In my wife's church, I keep hearing the word budget, and it drives me nuts. The top 3 are mission, mission, and mission. You have to find then creative ways in your annual giving effort to translate what you're raising money for into mission opportunity. People don't. Now, the insiders can respond to the idea that the annual fund turns on the lights and pays salaries, but those are the insiders. They understand it. They're part of the conversation, so they get it. For people outside of that, when you stand up and say, we've got to raise money for budget, it's instantly translated into salaries. And that's not a key motivator. Now, insider understands it, others don't. But any questions about what a capital campaign does? Let's look at here's something that it's really going to do. Fundraising is about change. If you don't like change, don't raise money. People don't fund yesterday's answers. Does that make sense? So fundraising, capital campaigns in particular, are always about change, whether you're building a new Christian center or sanctuary or whatever. It should be about change. You have to think differently, obviously, to create change, and you have to have a unique vision. What do donors seek? The studies show their top 10 reasons. What do you think the top reason is? What do you think the top thing that donors are seeking to an organization that they give to? Any guesses? Okay, that's not bad. That's good. Yeah, but it's not what I'm looking for. What else? Connection. Recognitions, that's one too, but it too is not. John Rockefeller, by the way, carried dimes in his pocket because he was superstitious. He was fearful that if he passed a beggar on the street without giving money to them, like it said in the Bible, the least of these, he thought it impeded his ability to get into heaven. And so he was scared to pass anybody by who asked for money. So he carried dimes in his pocket. So there's a lot of different motivations. Here's the top one. And this one is so far above number 2 that I want you to pay particular attention to it. Does your church have a credible, unique mission? The second is, and again, it was far down in priority in the top 10, but the second is leadership that they trust. And then the third is financial stability. Now there's an issue around stability. The president of Princeton says that a university must live dangerously or die on the vine. And I buy into this. Stability is death today in our society because we are in such a fast-moving history. By the time many of our organizations define what the problem is and what we think our answer to the problem is, the problem's changed today. And so financial stability can be the death of your organization. In the 11 congregations in the study, the Alban Institute book I mentioned, More Than Money, every one of them have such aggressive mission programs that they challenge their congregation every year to meet that. And yet every year they do meet it. So they talk about how when you go into their lobby prior to services, that the energy is almost crackling. You can feel it. There's an enthusiasm because of their focus on what they're trying to achieve as a congregation. And people respond to that. And here's why I think they do. Here's the formula for this. It's about impact. Now, so many organizations, they talk about, here's the problem we think is before us. Here are our answers to the problem. Here is the activity that we've spent around that. And that's it. The conversation ends there, when it really ought to be a message of stories of impact. Boil it down. It doesn't help to say we had 2,000 people in the last month attend services. Of the 2,000, how many were impacted spiritually? Could you boil it down? How many conversions did we have? How many joined the church? How many? Now I know that I'm not talking about what sometimes bishops are asking us to measure, but I'm talking about the collection of real stories of impact, how lives are changed, versus we had 300 people attend this event, or we had 25 access this material on the website. Oh, okay, of the 25, how many actually downloaded it? And of the ones that actually downloaded it, how many of them read it and it changed their thinking? They got involved in some way. Those are the stories of impact that you have to dig down to be able then to tell. But that's what's really critical is, you've heard the phrase, money follows mission. Well, it's the same here. Income follows impact. If you as a church can tell the stories of impact, you'll get income. And that was the 11 churches that we talked about in the Alban book, is they were telling the stories of impact regularly, all the time. But you have to ask. So if you're shy of asking for money, or you're shy of having a conversation about money in your church, you've got a problem, because people want to be asked. I keep telling my wife this about her church, is I have yet to have anybody, volunteer or pastor, come and sit with us and say, Susan and Scott, here's our vision for this year. Here's what we want to do. We'd like you to consider a gift of this to make this happen. I have yet to have them do that. And I keep telling her that it makes me feel like then that my contribution's not worthy of that conversation. And I don't know. I love the one-on-one. I'm important enough that they're going to share with me that vision. So here's another issue. How many of us call ourselves not-for-profit organizations? You know, and churches are not-for-profit, right, by law. I already have a problem with that. That word right there is already a negative for me. So I suggest when we sit down in our meetings, we change our thinking by changing what we label ourselves to be. We're organizations for impact. Forget the not-for-profit business. I'm in the impact business. Does that help at all? I don't know. It does for me. At Simatanga, I'm working with my board on this very issue. Let's get out of this idea that, yeah, I know, in a ministry, it's difficult to talk about entrepreneurialism. But we have to be entrepreneurial. We have to be an impact. We have to be focused on impact. And if we're not providing impact, then we need to go back and re-examine what it is we're doing. There's several components normally to a capital campaign. Case statement is up here, and we're going to talk more about case statements in a minute. Feasibility and planning studies. Outside counsel are going to ask you to consider doing that, and there's a cost to feasibility studies, but it's worth it. And the reason it's worth it is when your case statement has draft stamped on it and your priorities have draft stamped on it, it's really advantageous to share that draft with as many people as you can. Sit down with them face to face. And usually it helps to have outside counsel do this because they can say, you can say anything to me you want because I'm not going to share with the church leaders what you say. I'll share the import, but I won't tell them who said it. And from what the collective responses are to the feasibility study, then the church leadership will take that and reshape what hits people's hot buttons and what doesn't. That's one benefit to this. The other is it's your first opportunity to educate people as to your vision and where you're wanting to go. And people love to have their opinions asked. And this gives them an honest opportunity to be forthcoming about what it is they like and what they don't like. So also you would have a goal and funding priorities. We're thinking of raising X amount of money in the feasibility stage. Then when the study's over and you know what you're going to do, here's our goal. We're going to raise X amount and for these priorities. And there might be 3 or 4 or 5, whatever it is. All capital campaigns have a good plan. You create your plan and you work your plan. Problem is, like Napoleon said, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And so you have to be adaptable. You're going to find that your plan's not going to unfold as you think in the beginning, but that's okay as long as you're adaptable. And it doesn't hurt to make some mistakes, just don't keep making the mistake. When you bump into something, adapt and move on. Has a timetable and a table of gifts. We're going to talk about a table of gifts in a minute. Policies and guidelines. You're going to be confronted with people who say, I want to give, but I have a piece of property. Can I give you that piece of property? Or I have a stock gift I'd like to give. Can you process that? And you need to be able to do it. So you're going to have some policies and guidelines on how to process gifts, right? You're going to have a budget for your capital campaign. National average is 10 cents of every dollar raised is considered acceptable for cost, but truthfully, that's kind of bunk. It depends on where your church is in its giving history. If you're not mature around stewardship and giving, it may cost you 20 cents to raise a dollar. It all depends on how much education and cultivation and all that you have to do. And so while you want to keep your costs down, that's not the primary issue here. It's what is it going to take to help people understand and feel good about what you're trying to achieve. And it might cost you more to do that. It always costs more to get gifts from people who haven't given before. In annual giving on the university level, we often say that it's dollar for dollar fundraising. Sometimes it's $1.25 for dollar raised. Why does that make economic sense? Because in the second year, renewals are 60-70%, and it only costs a few cents to get that second gift. And so over time, it equals out. You build your donor base through your annual fund. So anyway, You get the drift, though, on cost per dollar raised. You're going to have staff and volunteer involvement, and a lot of it. You're going to have to be able to create a list of suspects, prospects, and donors. Donors are people who have given to you in the past. Prospects are people who you have a relationship with. You actually know who they are and what they think, something about what motivates them. Suspects are people who are sitting in the pews you know nothing about. Or maybe they're not attending, but they're on your roll. You don't know anything about them, they're suspects. I had a conversation with one nonprofit leader recently who said, oh, we've got all kinds of relationships, we just don't know who they are. That's not a relationship, that's a suspect. But his point was that they were reading their website, they knew they were taking their magazine or whatnot, but they knew nothing about them, so they're suspects. Multi-year pledges, and I'm going back to Henri now, and prayer and gratitude, right? In my business, we talk about finding 7 ways to say thank you in a year. 7 creative ways. So obviously that begins with a thank you for your pledge or thank you for your gift, but what else can we do? So your annual fund should look just like your capital campaign, truthfully. Why would that be? Because you're using your annual fund to help your congregation learn what stewardship, at least the giving of your treasure part of that, looks like. And so when the capital campaign comes along, it's just not this foreign animal. They're used to the process. So your annual fund should have the same components in it, believe it or not. And you can still have feasibility studies. I used to do this as an annual fund director. I would take the draft of my case for that year's annual fund, and I'd go test it with people. And it wasn't anonymous, but it gave them an opportunity to respond early on. The other is, obviously, 1-year pledges versus multi-year pledges. My father-in-law, at 94 years old, goes to work every day. He'll outlive me. He's been in the same pew, same church, at least 65 years, I think maybe 70 years. Sits in a pew under a stained glass window in memory of his wife. He never has pledged in all those years. Drives the finance committee nuts because they want to be able to predict, obviously, what that budget's going to look like for that year. Why doesn't he? Well, he loves responding to the family that needs help, or the air conditioning system that goes out, or the mission project that surfaces that wasn't considered at the beginning of the fiscal year. He loves responding to those gift opportunities. I had a pastor tell me at a church, I'm so concerned because our pledging's doing fine, same numbers, nominal increase over last year, but unpledged gifts have gone from 60,000 to 325,000. I'm really concerned about that. What's to be concerned about, I said. I mean, obviously, but our finance committee can't budget that. So what you're doing right is you're providing several new opportunities for people to give throughout the year versus just through one little window called the annual fund. And they're responding to it. And so celebrate it. Oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Okay, you've got a form in front of you called the Dove Preparedness Index. Another book that I don't suggest you buy it unless you want to get into real technical depth about capital campaigns. But it is the best book on capital campaigns. Kent Dove wrote it, and it's very good. But he has a piece in his book called the Dove Preparedness Index, and we're going to work through that in the next 30 minutes. After today, though, what I'd encourage you to do is get back with your finance committee or your capital campaign committee and work through the Dove Preparedness Index with them. And maybe do it 2 or 3 times over the next few months as you work toward your capital campaign, because hopefully the answers to the index will change as you progress. So these 10 prerequisites that's on that form that I gave you, it's a 1-page form. Do y'all have that? Scored on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, 1 being the lowest. And there are 3 key sections on there that carry more weight than the others, 4, 6, and 7. And we'll talk about those. They're scored in addition to the way the other 10 are. This is what the page looks like. So everybody there? Okay. Let's look at the first one. How do you rate yourself as to commitment to a capital campaign? Do all the key participants understand the commitment they're going to have to make in time and personal support? This is a long-term effort, gang. A lot of high-intensity activity as you get ready for the campaign, and then while you're asking, and then remember, you got to keep the energy and interest alive during the payment period of the pledges. So you're talking about 3 years of commitment, of conversation. If you don't keep the conversation going after the pledges are made, they're going to start reneging on their pledges, by the way. So this understanding of long-term commitment has to be by everybody. Who owns the campaign, by the way? Who's the lead player? How many of you think it's that person? Good. It's not. Now, of course, the pastor has to be one of the key voices, has to show commitment through their own giving. But the campaign belongs to the lay leaders, and they've got to understand that this is their priority. As long as the campaign is going, it's their priority. Oh, it doesn't mean that's the only thing that's important, but you can't afford to have a failed campaign. So how did you score on the first one? Okay. Let's talk about strategic planning. How many of you have a strategic plan for your church that's up to date, alive? When I say alive, it doesn't become this document you create and then you stick on the shelf and it gathers dust, never to see the light of day again. If you don't have a strategic plan, you're already hampered in your capital campaign endeavor, because credible fundraising comes from a clear vision. Your goals, what you're trying to raise money for, comes from a clear understanding of where you're headed. Does that make sense? It's particularly true today in larger givers, as they've become more sophisticated in their giving because they're asked to give more often. They want to almost see a business plan in addition to the ask. Show me where you are financially. Remember that? Financial stability? Show me where you are in your mission. Tell me about your leadership and what is their commitment. Let me see what the financial impact is going to be for the next 3 to 5 years. As the chair of Simitonga's board on Monday, when I sit down with that $722,000 donor, I'm going to have to answer all 3 of those questions for him. He's already told me. I want these clear understandings so I can pass that on to the other 2 trustees of the foundation. So I'm a little nervous. The executive director of Simitonga is working with me this weekend to answer those questions. I don't want to come off foolish. But your strategic plan has to really show church growth and improvement. Again, people don't fund yesterday's answers, at least not willingly. Which brings up a whole other issue about trying to run capital campaigns for debt retirement, doesn't it? What is the least attractive fundraising goal? It's for debt retirement. Oh, it's painful. But there are ways to position it, and good ways too. I mean, obviously, debt retirement's just a reality. But there are ways to position that will help you deal with it. But nonetheless, again, it's a yesterday's deal, and that's what makes it so hard. They're already seeing the benefit of it. So, gee, I have to pay for that now? I'd much rather pay for where we're headed next. And one of the ways you might be able to position that is we strategically went into debt trying to advance our mission quicker. And so, yes, we understood we were going to go into debt, but look at the benefit, look at the impact that this new building or this new program is having. And so it's worth our while to go into debt to make that happen quicker rather than waiting until all the stars were in alignment. That's one way to do it. The other is if we can retire the debt, that frees up the debt service toward new mission opportunities. So there's a couple of ways. The next then is fundraising objectives are based upon important and legitimate church plans. I've several times seen capital campaigns for churches where the priority is not bad, But it doesn't come from a plan. It doesn't come from an explanation of, within our mission, within where we want to be as a church, here's why this addition to our facility is important. Instead, it's just talked about, gosh, we need a new gym, so let's build a new gym. Well, you're missing out on a real opportunity to help people understand what the impact, going back again to that word, what's the impact of that gym going to be on the community, on the disenfranchised around us, on new programs that we can offer to people who aren't currently coming to our church. It also includes goals. What is the specific financial cost for that project? You got to really start working it down so you know this building is going to cost this much, or this endowment is going to do this much if we can raise this much. And you have to have a clear budget. So we know exactly what it's going to cost for us to put this in place. There are not going to be any cost overruns, that kind of assurance. And I like this. Needs have to be specific and urgent. The best kind of fundraising, in my experience, has to deal with crisis and urgency. People respond to that. It doesn't mean you create false crisis, but I keep waiting for my wife's church to say this well, and they never do. If we can raise this much more than we raised last year, we can feed 35 more families. We can build 2 more houses for Habitat for Humanity. We can go to eastern Alabama and help tornado victims. 25 more tornado victims. They oftentimes talk about budget, and it just drives me nuts. I'd love for, okay, if we don't raise this much, there are 35 families who are going to suffer. Going back then to case statement, the next item on that list, you have to look at it through the outsider's eyes. We're all insiders, and so we tend to write insider documents. Our language is different because we live with this. We've got to think about, what about the person in the pew who doesn't hear this on a regular basis? What do they need to hear? And so you have to really work at moving from your vision to what they're hearing. For instance, when we appeal on an annual basis to people in our congregation to give, most of the time what I hear is a message built around commitment and responsibility. Does that resonate? We, as insiders, are thinking about them sitting out there as being previous donors primarily, and so you appeal to people who are on the inside, who are on your finance committee, your administrative board, your staff, your people who are regular attendees. They get responsibility and commitment. Who doesn't get responsibility and commitment? Anybody who's not on the inside, and there are more who are not on the inside than are. So you have to appeal to them on the, Ken Callahan wrote it in his book. If you've read some of his books on finance and stewardship, his research showed that people who are not on the inside respond primarily to 2 appeals. And those 2 appeals are community and compassion. What we do as a church normally is turn then the speakers to the people who are not on the inside, and we appeal to them on responsibility and commitment by turning the volume up. And they hear more from us about responsibility and commitment louder and more often, when we should be providing them a message on community and commitment. Compassion, because that's what they're going to respond to. So if you're not looking at how you're appealing through their eyes, you're missing a bet. So obviously, your reasons for seeking support are not necessarily their reasons for giving it. Their reasons are emotional and psychological. This is the one I love. They want to give to your promise, your vision for the future. And here's the best one. Outsiders want to feel their best heart beating. They want to feel how good they are, how special they are, what a difference they are making in the world through your campaign. Does that make sense? All right. Let's look at a case statement real fast. This is a secular case statement. I like showing non-church case statements just so that, well, some of the best work is coming out in this arena. Sometimes churches' case statements tend to look much and sound much the same. And so I like to try to show a different perspective. Women's and Girls Fund in Rhode Island. I love black and white photography. This is not black and white, but it is kind of monochromatic. The bird guano on the statue's face looks like a tear, doesn't it? It's a very moving photograph. This is a 4-page case statement. Our values, and you can't read this obviously, but they're talking about access, collaboration, empowerment, integrity, transformation, response, leadership, equality. In 1 page, they've laid out, if we can raise this money, this is what young women in Rhode Island can have access to. Going back to what Henri Nouwen says about prayer and gratitude, then they go to the history. So we're going to say thank you, and we're going to share with you what previous fundraising efforts have done. So today, we're able to have this capital campaign conversation because of the generosity of the past. And here's what your past giving has achieved. So celebrate that, as we're also talking about where we're going next. And then finally, just frequently asked questions. This is one I like. Since the Women's Fund solicits donations, won't it compete with other organizations for money? And their answer is really kind of unique to me. Yeah, we are in competition for the dollar, although you probably won't be solicited by those other organizations. But if because we've talked to you and raised awareness about issues around young women, and it causes you to give to another cause, that's a blessing. And we celebrate that. So you go for it. I love that kind of thing. This is another. I didn't know Care International still existed. I remember it from my childhood. This too is a women's campaign for empowerment around the world. This is a 1-sentence case statement boiled down here. She has the power to change her world. You have the power to help her do it. That's pretty cool. There's some other language there that I like too, but this is an international campaign. I saw it in the airport in Birmingham recently. So, case statement's critical. Case statement, by the way, is written for your benefit more than the outsider's benefit, because it boils down the language and the priorities into something all of you can use. So the language is consistent. The rationale for raising the money, the argument's all there written so that no matter who says it, they've got a guide for it. So you've got to assess your church's stewardship program. How many of your church stewardship committees focus on fundraising only? Raise your hand if that's the case. No? Y'all broader in your discussion? One? The problem with this is congregations are smart. They know when you are hiding fundraising in the name of stewardship. Stewardship and fundraising, just like development and fundraising, are not synonymous. Stewardship's about how we use all of God's gifts, time, talent, and treasure. And so a stewardship committee, if it's functioning properly, will worry about the whole aspect of stewardship, not just the giving part. So do not make your stewardship committee an arm of the finance committee. Does that make sense?
Repeat that.
Do not make your stewardship committee an arm of the finance committee, because they have a much broader conversation to have with your congregation. And it's all about how we grow in our faith and how we husband and use what God gives us, time, talent, and treasure. And unless you have that full conversation, so many times you'll hear this in congregations who are not healthy in this. Only time they approach me is when they want money. So that will be the symptom of a church that has this out of skew. Now, some people use that as an excuse anyway, but for those who, you'll know the difference. What is your internal and external preparedness? Do you have policies and procedures to take gifts? Do you have a database system that keeps records but also manages the pledge process? And do you thank people for their gifts? The lay leader role, they're your champions. They invite others to be involved, and they've got to give commensurate gifts. Don't just ask for money, though. Be prepared in your strategy for whether it's your annual fund or your capital campaign to ask for their help, their engagement, involvement on committees, whatever. Give feedback. You see the case statement's got draft on the top. We're trying to shape this. What hits your hot button, what doesn't? It's a very non-threatening conversation to have with anybody in your congregation. People love to have their opinions asked. Give them an opportunity to respond. Lead gifts. This is a gift chart. People like me do this for campaigns all the time. This is a $100,000 goal. I just made it that so that you could do the math. If you're trying to raise $3 million, then you can change this. But in this case, the top 10 gifts will raise 42% of the goal. This is, and the number one gift is 10% of the total goal. This is a common strategy in capital campaigns, but it would also be, it could also apply to your annual giving effort. The next 20 gifts would would bring up the total to 61% of the total raise. So 30 gifts would raise 61%. This may not be right for your church, but this is very common in capital campaigns. It takes large gifts to raise large amounts. You've heard this phrase about 80% of the goal is raised by 20% of the donors. In secular giving, that's changed in America. 95% of the goal is often raised by 5% of the donors. I'm not sure how that translates into church fundraising, but the point is the same. You're going to have major gifts and you're going to have small gifts. Let me just say this. The most precious gift I've ever been involved in was around $45. Did I tell you all this? I forget from the last course and last presentation of this one. I was working for a Jesuit school, and they had an inner city high school, and they had a parents giving program. All parents were told 100% participation is the expectation. This grandmother who's raising her grandchild brought $45 in cash to me, and the only way her grandchild was able to go to Loyola was through scholarship. And she said, there is no way in the world my family is going to be left out of this parents fund. And she gave me $45 I know she didn't have. And the rationale that she gave, in addition to the fact that she didn't want to be left out, was around how grateful they were for how the school was saving her grandson. And she became the best spokesperson in that entire campaign for that school. We put her on the campaign committee. She was there with people who were giving $25,000 and $50,000. Her $45 gift was more precious than any of those. And in her testimony to why she was giving, oh my gosh, it was so impactful. So, just as a warning, and I remind myself of it all the time too, that $10,000 gift, yeah, really got to have it, but it's no more important than the $10 gift from the person who only has $10 to give. You celebrate all gifts. Going back then to more than money, a couple of things. In all 11 congregations, the pastor led the way in giving, and the congregation knew it. Most of the pastors, not all of them, stood up and said, here's what my wife and I are doing. It doesn't matter even if you don't do that. The congregation hears, learns for whatever osmosis way it happens. They know what the pastor's commitment is. And the pastor's commitment has a huge impact on the congregation's commitment. Tithing, I know that's a tough conversation for some congregations, but in all 11 of the case studies, tithing was a regular conversation in those churches. And I get those questions, okay, does tithing mean that this is before tax dollars or after tax dollars? Does it mean that it includes what I give to United Way and what I give to my church? So, you got to sort that out. I don't think the Bible gives me the light to do that. But what I do know is the more your faith matures, the less important that definition becomes. And in fact, you're fine, like the bishop said, you're trying to find ways to give more than 10% by doing less with other ways. So, I don't know. Pastors in all 11 case studies, though, shared a willingness to talk to the congregation about money. And it wasn't just about capital campaign money, it was also about the use of their money and how they lived. And then, of course, the fact that money is an indicator of spiritual health. Lead gifts, you got to have lead gifts. And so the gift chart, I think, identified that. Where is your church in its ability to have lead gifts? And the strategies for that, y'all saw some of this earlier. The leaders have to be prepared. 100% participation is critical by all the people who are involved. You're going to have to develop prospect list. And peer screening is important. Sitting down with people in your congregation and saying, who among our members do you think would respond well to this opportunity? Oh, I know Jim is involved with the Humane Society. He might like, that's kind of healthy conversation. Plus, we as Americans, we're good at this. We look at what cars people drive. We look at where their house is located. We know what they do as employment. There's a lot of indicators that we as a culture tag onto. And this screening for prospects is important. We all don't have to be John Wesley. We talked about that. Y'all saw these slides. The band again. I'm going to go through this. Bishop Odo, bless his heart. Consulting firms. We kind of flew through this earlier. I just want to hit on it. You're going to wonder, should we hire campaign counsel or not? And my suggestion is to do so. Yeah, they cost money, but it costs money to raise money. And rarely does your congregation have the expertise to design the plan, ensure the case is right, help the materials get developed, but more than that, drive the process. Keep the timeline in front of the committees and the volunteers. It's harder for volunteers to do than it is for a consultant who can come in, they're 50 miles from home, they're perceived as the expert, but they can also say things you can't say. They can pick up the phone and call a volunteer. You're not doing your bit. What can I do to help you? Or how can we get you to move on? Because you're holding up the game. It's easier for a consultant to do that. They are not solicitation firms, although they'll help you solicit gifts. Many times I would go with a donor, a volunteer, to make an ask, particularly if they were scared of saying a dollar amount. And I would do that part for them. Independent consultants are different in that they often have other work, but they're less expensive than campaign consulting firms. They can also have great records. But if you run into a problem, there's only one of them. So campaign consulting firm oftentimes has more people who can address the issue for you. It just depends on the experience. But again, volunteers or staff are going to have to carry the weight of this. Campaign counsel will not do it for you. So if you're expecting them to raise this money for you, you're going to be disappointed. Flat fee basis, don't hire anybody who wants to take their payment on a percentage basis. It's not right in fundraising. The professional organizations do not allow it. And there's real good reason for it. If we're raising $3 million, but it costs $100,000 for me to provide counsel for you, then that's a flat fee. And so what I get paid is not dependent on what you give. So I'm not sitting in front of you saying, would you consider a gift of $100,000, which, by the way, $10,000 of that comes to me. Does that make sense? So I don't get 10%. I'm paid a flat fee for the work I do for you. And, of course, a consultant will help you sort through all kinds of issues for your long-term stewardship program. There are two types of cost, operating cost, and you're going to incur those in your capital campaign whether you hire counsel or not, because you're going to have to produce video, postage, going to have travel and secretarial support. And volunteers and staff are going to rely on this kind of assistance. The other cost is service fee. So you just have to decide. And campaign counsel can cost anywhere, from, I don't know. When I worked for CCS, Allied Irish Bank, we charged $1,400 a day. And I was at that cause every day of the week for sometimes 2 and 3 years. So that was a different animal. Most of the campaign counsel you're going to be looking at are what we call spot consultants. They come in for 3 or 4 days a month, and they help you move through a process. Sometimes they'll be there for longer periods, depending on where you are in your campaign plan. But they'll charge $40,000, $50,000, $75,000. Just depends on how much work is going to be involved in that. But again, if you're raising $3 million, then that flat fee is just pennies on the dollar, and that's an acceptable cost. There's other factors then that you're going to have to be aware of. Those all should make sense. So the sheet that I handed you provides you with where you are in the DPI, helps you understand the scoring. And if you want to talk about that after you take this with me, I'm happy to walk through that with you. So 6 things you can do now, though. I mean, this, as I said, it's like getting a drink of water out of a fire hydrant. Here's what: develop a compelling vision for the future. Start building unity around the idea of capital campaign and what it's going to achieve. It's not too late to start teaching stewardship in its healthy style, in its entirety. Begin now to look at what is it going to cost us to raise the capital campaign money we need. Start looking at, do we have the bookkeeping software systems necessary to keep the data that we collect? And like Henri says, get on your knees and pray about this. Any questions or comments?
The only question is, how quickly can you get this presentation emailed out?
Tomorrow?
Oh, yeah, that works.
Okay. And now the quickest way for us today is if you email me and tell me, please send me the, and so if, my email address is sgilpin, let me go back to the, see if I can do this quickly. Oh, sgilpin@gbod.org. There's my cell phone number too, and my direct office phone number. So sgilpin@gbod.org. My cell phone 615-944-9711. And I'm often on the road. I'm rarely in the office, but my direct line is 340-7132. I've got 2 more things to hand out to you then. One is another kind of reminder on, is your church ready for a capital campaign using the DPI? And then here's a 2-page collection of quotes from Henri Nouwen's book that hopefully will add some more incentive for you to read that. Any questions? Sorry about we could spend an hour on each one of the items. That's the problem. And by the way, I should have made this offer too. As I travel, sometimes I pass right by some of your churches. So if you ever wanted, I don't know, if we were able to make the stars in alignment or something, if you ever wanted me to stop by and talk with your committee or something, I'd be happy to do that. Just have to kind of mesh schedules and whatnot. But I love that kind of thing, and that's what I'm paid to do anyway. Or you pay me to do. So give me an opportunity to do what I'm supposed to be doing. Anything else? All right, gang. Enjoyed being with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice meeting you.